Today, we're going to talk about the thematic material and overall meaning that is intertwined with the Petscop story. Sometimes it can be pretty easy to get lost in the weeds when constructing theories or attempting to solve the cryptic and ambiguous lore. So, in this video, I wanted to take a step back, give a more zoomed out look on Petscop, and talk about what kind of themes, morals, and deeper meanings it is trying to display as a work of art. Petscop, at its core, is about family trauma. Petscop obviously intended to be a horror story ever since it started, and what all horror stories need are some undesirable events transpiring in order to make them scary. Basically, most horror stories can also be considered to be part of the tragedy genre to some extent, due to this prerequisite to stimulate the horror. To accomplish this, Petscop draws from the actions of the mentally ill, often induced by some sort of trauma, bleeding out to affect their families and those around them. Specifically, it focuses on the suffering of the innocent, and no creature is more innocent than the young. Thus, the main horror of the series is found in the suffering of innocent children at the hands of mentally scarred adults. To make things worse, these children are often suffering under adults that should be the ones specifically caring for them. This horror concept is set up in the earliest episodes. The first thing we see is the gift plane when Paul explores Evencare, and we get to meet several pets that are undoubtedly parallels for children to some extent. Pets like Amber even explicitly display certain psychological concepts pertaining to children and caregiving in their description. Pen is in a similar vein, and of course, we all know the ramblings of the creator found in Tona's description. I go into deep detail in all of these in my analysis and theory videos about Petscop, but for the sake of this video, all we need to know is that Petscop purposely sets up a setting that drives the plot towards the idea of children in unfavorable circumstances. We can see that the caregivers have straight up left Evencare, the name of the level I'm quite sure is meant to ironically contrast with what is actually happening in the location, leaving the pets or kids in negligence. This type of atmosphere is amplified once the game transitions into the much darker plane of digital existence. We'll get to the actual plot beats that can be derived from Petscop after another important inclusion is called out: the presence of real world illusions that further convey an overarching theme. The most infamous one is the connection to Candace Newmaker, which is a tragedy that occurred in our reality that involved the sickening death of a young girl due to the failings and abusive practices of adults she had been entrusted to. The other is the connection to the Dr. Seuss book, Daisy Head Maisie, who struggles after sprouting a daisy out of her head, which prompts everyone around her to treat her in a variety of negative ways. There is also a nod to the strange situation experiment, which basically involved experimenting on children and their reactions to different adults entering and leaving the room. Like the abandoned and physically or psychologically challenged pets found in Evencare, these outside sources that Petscop hints towards portray the larger idea of children and how they are thrust into tragic circumstances by no fault of their own. With that being determined, now we can get into the more specifics of the plot of Petscop's story and surrounding lore. You're probably here because you enjoy stories, and one of the best ways to consume stories is through books and reading. For years now, I've been writing and publishing stories on various platforms, most notably my self published book series on Amazon. While I would label my genre here as science fiction and cosmic fantasy overall, each book has a special style to it that can cater to different genre preferences. Linear Highway and Genesis the Prince of Time are perfect for fans of high concept sci fi, whereas readers more interested in spiritual horror might find Cult of Shadows most intriguing. Or, if you're like me and really like cryptic stories that prompt you to solve the mystery as you go along, What's Gone Before and Frameless Mirror should be quite enjoyable. There's always the option to delve into the entire series, as all of my books are connected through one shared universe with ever expanding lore. In addition to these physical or digital books, I write horror stories on r/nosleep that can be found on my subreddit and fanfiction on Archive of Our Own that can be read completely for free. Also, if you prefer listening to audiobooks over reading, I create audiobook episodes of my writing weekly that can be accessed by becoming a channel member. If you become a member of the Lore Hunter tier, for only $4 a month, you can access any audiobook recording I've uploaded, as well as have instant access to the new episodes that are added every week, creating a growing library of audiobook content. While recordings of my free material may appear as a mainline video later on, any audiobooks of my purchasable writing will remain forever exclusive to channel members. Furthermore, if you want to do some investigating for yourself and attempt to uncover hidden lore, try out this ARG called Bleed Through the Music that I created alongside a friend. With the lore written by me and the music produced by my friend, we present a unique alternate reality game that blends tragedy with at times comedic execution in order to tell a cryptic and vague story through clues such as codes, lyrics, imagery, outside resources, meta storytelling, and pattern through lines that all culminate in one deeply interwoven narrative. Finally, if you want to interact with me and other people who are interested in the types of subjects we cover on this channel, I invite you to join the Playmaster Plus Discord server, where there will be regular updates on the happenings of the channel and my writing and discussions regarding lore and storytelling. Links to everything can be found in both this video's and the channel's description. A huge thanks to anyone who considers supporting my endeavors in any way, and now back to the investigation. As mentioned earlier, this isn't a theory video or story recap video, so there will obviously be a ton of story related stuff not mentioned. We're just going to take a look at the elements that most directly tie to the larger thematic material we are exploring. Horror stories, and most stories of some kind of conflict between two conscious entities, are driven by some form of antagonist. In Petscop, the most prominent antagonist is a man named Marvin Mark, and at some points in the timeline, a man named Daniel Hammond. Most of Marvin's character and motivations are centered around reviving his lost childhood friend named Lena. Marvin is clearly sick in the mind and obsessed with bringing her back into the world in the wake of her disappearance in the late 70s, and this growing darkness within him eventually got to the point to where he began to practice a rebirthing ritual that involved psychologically tormenting children to the point that they willingly participated in a ceremony that was meant to strip their current identity away and replace it with one of the dead's. Marvin's increasing insanity led to unrest in his household, no doubt tormenting his wife Anna, who was the sister of Lena, and the two of them eventually got divorced. As if growing up in this kind of environment wasn't enough for Carrie, the young daughter of Marvin and Anna, she would soon fall victim to Marvin after he breaks into his former home to abduct his own daughter. Marvin was convinced that Carrie was the reincarnation of Lena and brought her to an abandoned school building to enact a long term scheme that would end with her getting successfully reborn. When Carrie finally escaped, she was left understandably tormented and mentally scarred, this going on to affect her for the rest of her life. This drama that unfolds in the Mark family clearly displays the themes already discussed with a new element added into the mix. Anna and Carrie are suffering due to Marvin's mental instability and evil actions. He's a husband to Anna and a father to Carrie. He should be the guy that loves those two the most, but instead, he is actively doing the opposite of what any husband or father should, tormenting and tearing his family apart. However, we can trace all this behavior back to one catalyst moment, that being Lena's disappearance and probable death at the windmill. This introduces the idea of a tragedy turning into lasting trauma for an individual, specifically when it occurs to a young person that is still developing in their more formative years, and this gives us a perfect segue to talk about the other antagonist of the series. Daniel Hammond, also known by the pen name of Rainer, is the in-universe creator of Petscop. This means that almost everything we see or are told in the game is through his perspective. Knowing this, we get a good idea as to the downward mental spiral that Daniel goes through and his ensuing perception of reality. See, similar to Marvin, Daniel loses a young person very important to him, his brother Michael, who I believe was killed in the car crash that is repeatedly alluded to throughout Petscop. We also know that Daniel tried to rebirth a child as well, namely Belle into Tiara, an event that led to what seems to be a lasting identity confusion in the girl. This parallels Marvin's story pretty closely, a defining moment of tragedy that led to evil acts which in turn scar an innocent child forever. In all this, a unique character trait arises in Daniel, a belief that once someone is traumatized, they can never really be the same again. Daniel even shows us a chart that displays his understanding of the degradation of a child's happiness or well being. While it does seem that he believes a B child can be returned to an A child with proper care, it is heavily implied that he believes a child who has reached the NLM stage is beyond the point of no return. This ideology appears to extend to himself as well, as he eventually ends his own life, which in his case probably displays the hopelessness he felt of ever healing or finding redemption. However, just because this is Daniel's worldview, this depressing message isn't the ideal that Petscop is trying to communicate. The narrator type character that takes us through quite a few of the episodes is a person named Paul, and while there are differing opinions on his exact identity, he is undeniably deeply tied to the Mark/Leskowitz and Hammond bloodlines. As the present day part of the story progresses, Paul finds himself engaging in what appears to be a simulated rebirthing process within the game. However, instead of playing the music that he was instructed to play, music that was meant to play a part in morphing an identity over to Marvin's desires, Paul played his own melody. The entire point of rebirthing is for someone to change a kid into what they want them to be, breaking their self worth down and then reconstructing it to their desires. The ending of the series, though, shows triumph in the rejection of this idea, instead highlighting how Paul confirmed who he was as an individual, playing his own melody instead of conforming to what the sick people around him wanted him to be. Furthermore, the focus on the scene showing how Paul corrected Belle's label of the two of them being friends to family lightly shows how family can be a chosen relationship. As we've discussed, much of Petscop shows how children can be born into terrible scenarios that they had absolutely nothing to do with, having to grow up in a broken household simply because they were born. The finale scene shows how sometimes the family one was born into isn't who their true family is, and familial connection can be found in others that genuinely care in a way that they should. All this wraps into the more positive theme or moral that I believe is present in Petscop: the importance of moving on, healing from trauma and tragedy, and leaving the past behind to forge a new future. Marvin's insanity sprung from his inability to heal from his beloved friend's disappearance, Daniel's instability spiraling out of his brother's tragic death that he could never properly cope with. But the ending of the series gives hope that Paul and Belle's characters are finding a way to break free from their family's tortured history, finding happiness by leaving the cycle of abuse. Petscop once mentions a loop, and I think that is used to highlight the idea of inherited generational trauma, which is the long term result of these abusive family members. The sins of the parents often get handed down to their children, which can mess them up in different and lingering ways, which can in turn then be inherited by their children. If this cycle, this loop, is never broken, it can create for this family line of tragedy and suffering. Paul and Belle represent the hope for one generation to be able to break the loop and mend the cycle. In this way, while Petscop is overall a very dark and tragic story, it does portray a hopeful note by the series' end. I hope you enjoyed this more thematic approach to Petscop, and I know we've touched upon a lot of these concepts in my larger Petscop investigation, but due to the complicated and oftentimes very analytical approach that theorizing demands, I wanted to take a moment to appreciate the grander ideas that Petscop was communicating. If you enjoyed this type of content, please subscribe, like, and comment to help me out. And of course, a big thanks to my currently one channel member for being a top fan of the channel, Night Rain. More storyline oriented videos are on the way, but for now, the unknown persists, so the investigation continues.